Sultan Mehmed II, remembered in Islamic and Ottoman history as Fatih Sultan Mehmed, meaning Mehmed the Conqueror, was one of the most important rulers of the 15th century. He was born on 30 March 1432 in Edirne, the capital of the Ottoman state at that time, as the son of Sultan Murad II. Mehmed was born into a dynasty that had already transformed from a small frontier principality into one of the most powerful states in southeastern Europe and Anatolia. His father, Murad II, was an experienced military ruler who had fought against Christian powers in the Balkans and against rival Muslim states in Anatolia. From an early age, Mehmed was therefore raised in an environment where politics, military affairs, religion, administration, and diplomacy were closely connected. His childhood was not that of an ordinary prince. He was expected to become a ruler, and his education was designed to prepare him for the enormous responsibilities of the Ottoman throne. Mehmed received instruction from several respected scholars, including religious scholars who taught him the Quran, Islamic law, theology, history, and Arabic and Persian literature. He also learned languages and became interested in the intellectual traditions of different civilizations. His education was unusually broad for a medieval ruler. He studied military science, mathematics, geography, philosophy, and political history, while also becoming familiar with the traditions of the Byzantine and classical worlds. These interests later influenced his vision of Constantinople and the empire he wanted to build. Mehmed's first experience as sultan came when he was still a teenager. In 1444, Murad II temporarily withdrew from the throne after concluding the Treaty of Szeged with several Christian powers. Mehmed, who was only about 12 years old, became sultan. His youth made the situation extremely difficult. Ottoman ministers and military commanders had to deal with a ruler who was still a child, while foreign powers saw an opportunity to challenge the Ottoman state. The situation quickly deteriorated, and Christian armies entered the Balkans. Murad II was eventually called back to command the Ottoman army. He defeated the crusading forces at the Battle of Varna in 1444, demonstrating that the Ottoman state could not easily be threatened simply because its young prince sat on the throne. Murad later returned to power, while Mehmed continued his education and preparation. During these years, the young prince developed a strong personality and an ambitious vision of kingship. He was fascinated by the city of Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire. For centuries, Constantinople had stood at the crossroads between Europe and Asia. Although the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a small territory surrounding the city, Constantinople remained enormously important because of its history, strategic position, wealth, and symbolic significance. For Ottoman rulers, the conquest of the city had been a long-standing objective. Several earlier Ottoman sultans had attempted to bring it under their control, but the city's massive walls and strategic location had protected it. Mehmed grew increasingly determined to succeed where earlier rulers had failed. When Murad II died in 1451, Mehmed returned to the Ottoman throne at the age of 19. Many European rulers initially believed that the young sultan might be inexperienced and therefore easier to challenge. They underestimated him. Mehmed immediately began strengthening his position. He dealt with potential rivals in Anatolia and carefully managed relations with neighboring powers. He understood that a successful attack on Constantinople required more than bravery. It required preparation, money, soldiers, ships, artillery, engineers, diplomacy, and careful planning. One of his most important preparations was the construction of Rumeli Hisari, a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosporus. The fortress was positioned opposite the older Ottoman fortress Anadolu Hisari. Together, the two fortifications allowed the Ottomans to control movement through the Bosporus. This was crucial, because Constantinople depended heavily on maritime connections, and Mehmed wanted to restrict the ability of the Byzantine government to receive assistance from the Black Sea. He also began collecting enormous quantities of supplies and constructing weapons. One of the most significant developments was the use of large cannons. Mehmed understood that traditional siege techniques might not be enough against Constantinople's famous defensive walls. He therefore employed specialists capable of producing enormous artillery pieces. Among them was the Hungarian cannon founder known as Urban, who helped construct extremely large guns for the Ottoman siege. Mehmed's preparations reveal something important about his character. He was not simply a warrior seeking glory. He was a ruler who understood organization, technology, logistics, and psychological warfare. By the beginning of 1453, he had created an army capable of conducting one of the most famous sieges in medieval history. His objective was now clear: Constantinople. The young sultan was about to attempt something that generations of rulers had failed to accomplish. In the spring of 1453, Sultan Mehmed II began the campaign that would permanently change his place in history. Constantinople was governed by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the final Byzantine emperor. By this time, the Byzantine Empire was only a shadow of the vast Roman Empire that had once controlled territories around the Mediterranean. Yet, Constantinople itself remained a formidable city. Its defensive system was among the strongest in the medieval world. The famous Theodosian walls stretched across the landward side of the city, consisting of multiple defensive layers, towers, and fortified sections. For centuries, these walls had protected Constantinople from armies that greatly outnumbered its defenders. Constantine XI understood the danger facing the city and appealed to Christian Europe for assistance. Some soldiers and volunteers arrived, including Genoese troops commanded by Giovanni Giustiniani, an experienced military leader who played an important role in the city's defense. The Byzantine defenders were heavily outnumbered, but they possessed an enormous advantage: the city's fortifications. Mehmed's army arrived before Constantinople in April 1453. Ottoman forces included soldiers from many parts of the empire, including professional infantry, cavalry, and the elite janissaries. The Ottoman army also possessed powerful artillery. Mehmed positioned his forces around the city and began bombarding the walls. The great cannons produced enormous damage, but they also required careful operation because their size made them difficult to transport and fire repeatedly. The defenders worked continuously to repair breaches created by Ottoman artillery. The siege quickly became a contest between Ottoman offensive power and Byzantine defensive determination. Constantinople was also protected by the Golden Horn, a strategically important harbor. The defenders had placed a massive chain across the entrance to prevent enemy ships from entering. Mehmed understood that controlling the sea was essential. Ottoman ships attempted to operate around the city, but the defenders were able to prevent a direct Ottoman naval breakthrough. Then Mehmed made one of the most famous decisions of the entire campaign. Ottoman ships were transported overland from the Bosporus into the Golden Horn, bypassing the defensive chain. Historians continue to discuss the precise methods used, but the operation demonstrated Mehmed's willingness to use unconventional solutions. The arrival of Ottoman ships inside the Golden Horn placed additional pressure on the defenders. The siege continued for weeks. The city was exhausted, while food supplies were becoming increasingly limited. The defenders were forced to repair walls constantly, while facing artillery bombardment and repeated Ottoman attacks. Mehmed also attempted negotiations, but no agreement was reached that would preserve Byzantine control of the city. As May approached its end, the Ottoman Sultan decided that the final assault would take place on 29 May 1453. Before the attack, Mehmed addressed his troops and encouraged them to fight with determination. The Ottomans launched the final assault during the early hours of the morning. Waves of Ottoman troops attacked the walls, putting enormous pressure on the defenders. The fighting was intense. At one point, Giustiniani was seriously wounded and removed from the battlefield, creating a crisis among the defenders. The exact details of the final moments remain debated in historical sources, but eventually Ottoman troops succeeded in entering the city. Constantinople had fallen. Emperor Constantine XI disappeared during the fighting, and was traditionally believed to have died defending the city. Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople after the conquest. The fall of the city marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, which had existed in various forms for more than 1,000 years after the ancient Roman period. Mehmed was only 21 years old. His achievement immediately transformed his reputation. He became known as Fatih, the Conqueror. Yet the conquest was not simply a military victory. It represented a major transformation in world history. Constantinople became the new imperial center of the Ottoman state, and Mehmed began transforming the city into a capital worthy of a major empire. He ordered repairs to damaged buildings and encouraged people from different parts of his territories to settle in the city. Churches, markets, public buildings, and neighborhoods were restored or reorganized. The city gradually became known among the Ottomans as Istanbul, although Constantinople remained an important historical name for centuries. Mehmed's conquest also had consequences far beyond the Ottoman Empire. European powers became increasingly concerned about Ottoman expansion, while the Ottoman state gained control over one of the most strategically important cities in the world. The conquest connected Ottoman territories in Europe and Asia more securely, and gave the Sultan a political and symbolic position that previous Ottoman rulers had not possessed. Mehmed no longer saw himself merely as the ruler of an expanding Turkish dynasty. He increasingly presented himself as the successor to the imperial traditions associated with Constantinople and Rome. The conquest, therefore, became the foundation for the next stage of his rule. After conquering Constantinople, Mehmed II did not stop expanding his empire. The conquest gave him enormous prestige, but the Ottoman state still faced powerful rivals in the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Black Sea region. Mehmed understood that Constantinople could only become a secure imperial capital if the surrounding territories were firmly controlled. During the following decades, he launched campaigns that expanded Ottoman power across southeastern Europe and Anatolia. He also worked to strengthen the central government and reduce the independence of powerful local rulers. In Anatolia, the Ottoman Empire faced rival Turkish and Muslim states. Mehmed sought to bring these territories under Ottoman authority, sometimes through military campaigns and sometimes through political arrangements. His campaigns contributed to the gradual consolidation of Anatolia under Ottoman rule. In the Balkans, Ottoman armies continued to fight against Christian kingdoms and regional powers. Mehmed's forces faced resistance from Hungary, Serbia, Albania, Wallachia, and other states. One of the most famous opponents was Skanderbeg, the Albanian leader who organized prolonged resistance against Ottoman expansion. Mehmed personally recognized the difficulty of conquering Albania and launched campaigns against the region. Although Ottoman forces eventually gained greater control, resistance continued during Mehmed's lifetime. The Sultan also faced the Kingdom of Hungary, one of the most important Christian powers in southeastern Europe. Ottoman expansion towards Central Europe eventually brought the empire into direct conflict with Hungarian forces. Mehmed's reign was therefore characterized by almost continuous military activity. Yet he was not interested only in conquest. He was also building a sophisticated imperial government. After Constantinople became his capital, Mehmed began reorganizing the city's administration and population. He encouraged the migration of Muslims, Christians, Jews, merchants, artisans, scholars, and officials into the city. This helped revive Constantinople's population after the destruction and demographic decline of the previous centuries. Mehmed recognized that a successful empire required productive cities, trade, taxation, and administration. He therefore supported commercial activity and established institutions that helped make the capital an important economic center. His policies toward religious communities were also significant. Non-Muslim populations continued to live within the empire and were incorporated into the Ottoman administrative system. Christian and Jewish communities retained religious institutions under Ottoman authority. although they were subject to the legal and political structures of the Islamic State. Mehmed's imperial vision was broader than that of many earlier Ottoman rulers. He regarded himself as an emperor, and adopted the title Kaiseri Rum, meaning Caesar of Rome, after the conquest of Constantinople. This reflected his belief that the Ottoman Sultan was now the successor to the imperial authority centered in the city. His interest in the classical world was genuine. He collected books, employed scholars, and welcomed intellectuals from different traditions. His court became a place where Islamic, Byzantine, Persian, and European cultural influences interacted. Mehmed was particularly interested in geography and history. He reportedly commissioned works describing different regions and peoples, because understanding geography was essential to imperial expansion. Art also played a role at his court. The Venetian painter Gentile Bellini later visited Constantinople and painted a famous portrait of Mehmed. This demonstrates that Mehmed was willing to engage with European artistic traditions, despite the political and religious conflicts between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe. Mehmed also introduced important legal and administrative reforms. The Ottoman state was becoming increasingly centralized, and the Sultan sought to establish clearer rules governing government officials, military institutions, taxation, and the operation of the palace. His reign therefore helped shape the institutional structure that allowed the Ottoman Empire to survive and expand for centuries after his death. The Topkapi Palace complex and the broader imperial institutions associated with Constantinople developed during the period following the conquest. Mehmed also continued his interest in architecture. Major mosques, schools, markets, bridges, and public buildings were constructed throughout the empire. The Fatih Mosque complex in Constantinople became one of the most important monuments associated with his reign. It was not simply a mosque, but a large educational and charitable complex containing institutions serving the population. Through such projects, Mehmed sought to turn his conquered capital into an Islamic imperial city. At the same time, his reign was not peaceful or universally admired. His wars were costly, and his policies toward rivals could be severe. Medieval rulers frequently used executions, forced migrations, confiscations, and military campaigns as instruments of state power, and Mehmed was no exception. The famous Ottoman practice associated with dynastic succession, in which potential royal rivals could be eliminated to prevent civil war, became formally associated with the legal code attributed to his reign. His political methods reflected the harsh realities of 15th-century imperial politics. Nevertheless, Mehmed's achievements were extraordinary. By the final years of his life, the Ottoman Empire had become substantially larger and more centralized than it had been when he first became Sultan. Constantinople had been transformed into the center of an expanding empire. Ottoman control over Anatolia had increased, and Ottoman influence in southeastern Europe had become dominant. Mehmed had turned the victory of 1453 into the foundation of a much larger imperial project. The final years of Sultan Mehmed II's life were filled with further military campaigns and ambitious plans. Although he had already achieved one of the most famous conquests in world history, Mehmed continued to believe that the Ottoman Empire could expand even farther. His enemies included powerful states in Europe, rival political forces in Anatolia, and maritime powers controlling important territories in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. One of the most important developments during his reign was Ottoman expansion into the Black Sea. Mehmed's forces conquered Trebizond in 1461, ending the Empire of Trebizond, a Byzantine successor state that had survived for more than 2 centuries after the Fourth Crusade. The conquest strengthened Ottoman control over the eastern Black Sea and removed another potential rival. Mehmed also fought against Genoese and Venetian interests. These maritime republics possessed important commercial networks and colonies, and their rivalry with the Ottoman Empire was both economic and military. Ottoman expansion threatened their trade routes and territorial possessions, leading to prolonged conflicts. Mehmed's armies and navy gradually increased Ottoman influence across the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. In the Balkans, Ottoman forces continued their campaigns against Christian states. The Sultan's long-term ambition appears to have extended beyond the territories he had already conquered. He wanted to establish the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power connecting Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean. His vision was imperial rather than merely regional. However, constant warfare placed enormous demands on the Ottoman treasury, army, and population. Mehmed's final campaign began in 1481. The exact objective of this campaign has been debated by historians. Some evidence suggests that the Sultan planned to campaign against territories in the west, while other possibilities have been proposed. Mehmed left Constantinople with his army, but became seriously ill during the journey. On 3 May 1481, Sultan Mehmed II died near Gebze in the region of present-day Turkey. He was 49 years old. His death immediately created a succession crisis between his sons, Bayezid and Cem. The struggle eventually resulted in Bayezid becoming Sultan Bayezid II, while Cem spent years attempting to challenge his brother's authority. Mehmed's death therefore marked the end of one of the most transformative reigns in Ottoman history. His body was brought back to Constantinople and buried at the Fatih Mosque complex. Yet his historical influence did not end with his death. The empire he left behind continued expanding for centuries. His successors inherited a powerful centralized state, with Constantinople at its center. The Ottoman Empire would later reach even greater territorial heights under rulers such as Selim I and Suleiman I, but many of the foundations for that expansion had been strengthened during Mehmed's reign. His conquest of Constantinople became one of the defining events of the medieval and early modern transition. Historians have sometimes described 1453 as a symbolic end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of a new era, although the transition was much more complicated than a single date suggests. The conquest certainly had major consequences for international politics, trade, warfare, and diplomacy. Ottoman control over Constantinople changed the balance of power between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. It also encouraged European states to search for alternative commercial routes to Asia. Although the relationship between the Ottoman conquest and the later European voyages of exploration was complex, and should not be reduced to a simple cause and effect story. Mehmed's legacy was also intellectual and cultural. He supported scholars, poets, architects, artists, and administrators. He was interested in different civilizations and attempted to combine Ottoman Islamic traditions with elements of the Byzantine and classical imperial heritage of Constantinople. This made him unusual among rulers of his period. He wanted his capital to represent not only military victory, but also intellectual and cultural greatness. His reputation developed differently in different historical traditions. In Ottoman and Muslim historical writing, he became celebrated as Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror who fulfilled the long-awaited conquest of Constantinople. The conquest was also connected by Muslim writers to traditions concerning the city and the virtues of the commander who would conquer it. In Byzantine and some European traditions, Mehmed was remembered as the ruler who destroyed the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire. Modern historians generally approach him in a more complex way, recognizing both his military achievements and the harsh realities of his rule. He was ambitious, intelligent, disciplined, sometimes ruthless, and deeply interested in knowledge and empire. He was not simply a legendary warrior. He was a statesman who understood that conquest had to be followed by administration, economic development, population policies, architecture, law, and diplomacy. That combination explains why his reign had such a lasting effect. Sultan Mehmed II ruled for relatively few years compared with the enormous length of Ottoman history, yet his actions permanently changed the direction of the empire. He captured Constantinople at only 21, transformed it into an imperial capital, expanded Ottoman territory across Europe and Asia, strengthened the central government, supported education and architecture, and established an imperial vision that his successors continued. More than 5 centuries after his death, the image of Fatih Sultan Mehmed remains closely associated with the conquest of Constantinople. His story is ultimately the story of a young prince who inherited a powerful but still developing state and transformed it into a major empire. The walls of Constantinople, which had resisted countless armies for centuries, fell before him in 1453. From that moment onward, the city became the heart of the Ottoman world. His title, Fatih, the Conqueror, therefore became more than a military nickname. It represented the defining achievement of a ruler whose decisions helped shape the history of the Ottoman Empire and the wider world.